It was August 10th, 1996, at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. Tupac was performing what would become one of his most memorable concerts, but sitting in the front row was the woman who had shaped not just his music, but his entire understanding of justice, resistance, and what it meant to be black in America. Afeni Shakur, former Black Panther political prisoner and revolutionary mother, had come to see her son perform, but she was about to become the evening's most important voice. The concert had started as pure celebration. Tupac was electric on stage, the crowd was worshiping every word, and Death Row Records was demonstrating its cultural dominance. But as the evening progressed, Tupac began incorporating more political themes into his performance, talking between songs about police brutality, systemic racism, and the ongoing struggle for equality that had defined his entire life. It was during a break between songs that Tupac made a decision that would transform the evening from entertainment into education, from concert into civil rights rally. "Y'all know my music," he said to the crowd, his voice carrying that combination of confidence and vulnerability that made every word feel important. "But tonight I want y'all to hear from the woman who taught me everything I know about fighting for what's right." He gestured toward the front row where Afeni sat wearing a simple black dress and the kind of dignified composure that came from decades of speaking truth to power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tupac announced, "my mother Afeni Shakur." The crowd's reaction was immediate and respectful. They understood that they were being introduced to someone whose importance went far beyond being a celebrity's parent. As Afeni made her way onto the stage, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who had addressed crowds before, Tupac's expression showed a mixture of pride, respect, and love that was visible to everyone in the venue. "Mama," he said, handing her the microphone, "tell these people who you are." Afeni looked out at the massive crowd, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting battles that others were afraid to even acknowledge. "My name is Afeni Shakur," she began, and her voice carried clearly to every corner of the Rose Bowl. "And I am a Black Panther." The crowd erupted in applause, understanding immediately that they were hearing from someone who had been on the front lines of the civil rights movement. But what Afeni said next would educate an entire generation about struggles they had never fully understood. "In 1969, I was arrested along with 20 other Black Panthers and charged with conspiracy to bomb department stores, police stations, and other buildings in New York City," she continued, her voice steady and clear. "I spent 11 months in prison while pregnant with this man right here." She gestured toward Tupac, who was listening with the intense attention of someone hearing familiar stories that never lost their power. "They called us terrorists," Afeni said, and her voice carried both pain and defiance. "They said we were dangerous criminals who hated America, but let me tell you what we really were." The crowd was completely silent, understanding that they were receiving a history lesson that no textbook would ever provide. "We were young black people who were tired of watching our communities be destroyed by poverty, violence, and neglect, while the government did nothing to help us and everything to harm us." The words hit the crowd like a revelation. Many of them had grown up hearing about the Black Panthers only through negative stereotypes and government propaganda. "We started breakfast programs for children who were going to school hungry," Afeni continued. "We provided free medical clinics in neighborhoods where people couldn't afford health care. We created educational programs to teach black children about their history and their worth." As she spoke, it became clear that the crowd was learning about aspects of Black Panther history that had been deliberately hidden from mainstream American education. "But they didn't want to talk about the breakfast programs," Afeni said, her voice growing stronger and more passionate. "They didn't want to talk about the medical clinics or the schools. They only wanted to talk about the guns." She paused, looking out at 42,000 faces that were hanging on every word. "And yes, we carried guns. Because when you're trying to protect your community from police brutality and racist violence, sometimes you need to be able to defend yourself." The crowd's response showed that they were beginning to understand the context and complexity of struggles they had never fully grasped. "They put me in prison while I was pregnant," Afeni continued, "and they tried to make sure my son would never be born free. But this man right here," she pointed to Tupac with obvious pride, "he was born in struggle, raised in resistance, and destined to carry on the fight for justice." Tupac's expression showed the deep emotional impact of hearing his mother tell their story to such a massive audience. But Afeni wasn't finished with her history lesson. "The Panther 21 trial lasted 2 years," she said. "They had undercover agents, false witnesses, manufactured evidence, everything they needed to send us to prison for life. But we defended ourselves. I studied law in prison, represented myself in court, and we won." The crowd erupted in applause, understanding that they were hearing about a legal victory that had been largely ignored by mainstream media. "We were acquitted of all charges," Afeni announced, "because a jury of our peers understood that fighting for your community's survival is not terrorism, it's patriotism." The power of that statement resonated throughout the stadium, but what Afeni said next would connect the struggles of the 1960s to the realities of the 1990s. 30 years later, young black people are still dying in the streets, she said, her voice carrying both sadness and determination. They're still being targeted by police. They're still being denied equal opportunities in education, employment, and housing. She turned to look at Tupac, then back at the crowd. "This is why my son's music matters. Not because it's entertaining, but because it's continuing the work that we started in the Panthers. It's telling truth about what life is really like for black people in America." The crowd was beginning to understand that Tupac's controversial lyrics and political messages were part of a much larger historical tradition of resistance and truth-telling. When he raps about police brutality, he's speaking from experience that goes back generations, Afeni continued. When he talks about systemic inequality, he's describing problems that we were fighting in the 1960s and that are still destroying communities today. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the stadium. "The methods change, but the struggle continues," she said. "We used breakfast programs and legal challenges. This generation uses music and media, but the goal is the same, and to wake people up and make them understand that change is necessary." What happened next would create one of the most powerful moments in concert history. "I want to sing something with my son," Afeni announced. "Something that represents both the struggle and the hope." Tupac nodded, understanding immediately what his mother had in mind. Together they began performing "Keep Ya Head Up," but they transformed it into something that was part song, part sermon, part rallying cry. Afeni's voice, carrying decades of experience and wisdom, blended with Tupac's powerful delivery to create something that transcended entertainment and became pure inspiration. "Some say the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice," they sang together, but the words carried additional weight coming from a mother and son who had lived through different eras of the same struggle. As they performed, Afeni would periodically stop singing to speak directly to the crowd about specific issues, about the importance of education, about the need to support black businesses, about the power of voting, about the responsibility that came with success. "Young people," she said during one of these spoken interludes, "your voices matter, your votes matter, your choices matter. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't change the world." The crowd's response was unlike anything ever heard at a concert. This wasn't just applause, it was affirmation, commitment, understanding. But the most powerful moment came when Afeni addressed the young women in the audience directly. "To the young sisters out there," she said, "remember that you come from a line of strong black women who survived slavery, segregation, and every attempt to break our spirits. You have power in your blood. Use it." The response from the female audience members was emotional and overwhelming. Many were crying, understanding that they were hearing words of empowerment that they had never heard before. When the performance ended, the standing ovation lasted for over 10 minutes. 42,000 people were on their feet, not just applauding a performance but showing respect for a living piece of civil rights history. But Afeni had one final message. "The revolution isn't over," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the stadium. "It's just changing forms. My generation fought in the streets and in the courts. This generation fights through music and media. Your generation will find new ways to continue the struggle." She looked directly at the younger faces in the crowd. "But remember this, freedom isn't free. Equality isn't automatic. Justice doesn't happen by accident. Every generation has to fight for these things. And now it's your turn." The immediate impact of Afeni's speech was visible throughout the venue. People were hugging strangers, having intense conversations about politics and history, making commitments to get more involved in their communities. But the long-term impact would be even more significant. Within days, voter registration drives were being organized by concert attendees who had been inspired by Afeni's words. Community organizations reported increases in volunteerism from young people who wanted to continue the work she had described. Colleges and universities began inviting Afeni to speak about her experiences as a Black Panther and political prisoner, understanding that she could provide historical context that was missing from most educational curricula. The video of her speech, recorded by multiple audience members, became one of the most shared political messages in early internet history, reaching millions of people who had never heard authentic Black Panther history directly from someone who had lived it. Music critics began writing about the concert as a turning point in hip-hop culture, the moment when the genre's political potential was fully realized through the connection between different generations of black activism. For Tupac, sharing the stage with his mother reinforced his understanding of his role as more than just an entertainer. He was part of a continuing tradition of resistance and truth-telling that connected him to movements and struggles that were much larger than his individual career. In interviews following the concert, he often referenced that night as one of the most important performances of his life, not because of the music, but because of the opportunity to honor his mother's legacy and continue her work through his own platform. The concert also influenced how other hip-hop artists approached political content in their work. Seeing the powerful response to authentic historical education, many performers began incorporating more substantive political messages into their music and performances. Today, the Rose Bowl includes that concert in their official history as one of the most significant cultural and political events ever held at the venue, recognizing its importance not just to music but to ongoing struggles for civil rights and social justice. Civil rights organizations regularly show footage from Afeni's speech as an example of how personal testimony and authentic history can educate and inspire new generations of activists. Educational institutions use the performance as a case study in how popular culture can be used to provide historical context and political education that reaches audiences who might not otherwise engage with these topics. 28 years later, Afeni Shakur's speech at Tupac's concert remains one of the most powerful examples of how music platforms can be used for education, inspiration, and political awakening. The 42,000 people who witnessed her testimony became carriers of Black Panther history and civil rights knowledge that had been largely hidden from mainstream American education. The stage that had been intended for entertainment became a classroom for history, showing that sometimes the most important performances are the ones that connect past struggles to present realities and future possibilities. If this story moved you too, hit that like. For more powerful stories, subscribe and get ready for the next revelation.